Humankind has always wanted to fly like the birds. It's difficult, though, to establish whether this intrepid birdman thought he had a flying machine or a parachute when he leapt from the Eiffel Tower in Paris in the early years of this century. Whatever his concept, he was prepared with remarkable coolness to put it to the ultimate test. The result was tragic. Other inventors discovered the hard way that human muscles alone could not propel a flying machine. Yet the French Montgolfier brothers and others had flown in hot air balloons from the 1780s. By the mid-19th century, tethered balloons were being used for military observation. Balloons relied on gases which were lighter than air, but a successful heavier-than-air flying machine had to await the advent of the internal combustion engine. Thus, it was not until the end of 1903 that the first successful flight by what became known as the aeroplane or aircraft was made. This was by the Wright brothers, near Kill Devil Hill in North Carolina, USA. Flying immediately caught the public imagination, and within a few years all the major nations were developing aircraft. It was the French pilot Louis Blériot who took the next significant step forward in powered flight. In June 1909, he became the first person to fly the English Channel. This reinforced the belief that aircraft could have a military role. It was the Italians, however, who first used them in war, in their conflict against the Turks in Libya in 1911. The internal combustion engine also brought about the development of the airship. This came in two basic types: the non-rigid, popularly known as the blimp, with an envelope made of rubberized cotton or linen fabric, and the rigid form, of which the most well-known was the German Zeppelin, which had a metal frame. By the time war began in 1914, aircraft were of three basic types. Two were the monoplane and biplane tractor aircraft, with the engine mounted in the nose. The third was the biplane pusher, with the engine mounted in the rear of the cockpit. At the outbreak of war, the French had no less than 138 aircraft, organized into 25 squadrons. The British had about 60 aircraft, while the Germans had 5 air battalions totaling some 100 aircraft. By 1918, these and other fledgling air forces had increased their size by many times, the Germans, French and British having each produced some 50,000 aircraft during the course of the Great War. Initially, aircraft were used by the armies for reconnaissance. This early German AEG biplane was used in this role during the Battle of Tannenberg on the Eastern Front in August 1914 and played an important role in the German victory. These scouts, as they were called, were unarmed. This was even though, as early as 1911, The Americans had carried out experiments in firing machine guns and dropping bombs from aircraft, and Italian aircraft had done the same in Libya. Pilots soon realized that they needed to prevent enemy aircraft from seeing what was happening on the ground, and began to arm their aircraft. But the day of the true fighting scout had to wait until an effective means had been found to fire machine guns accurately in flight. A forward-firing gun could be mounted on the upper wing, but this made reloading difficult. It could be placed on the side of the cockpit, but accurate fire was almost impossible. Pusher aircraft, like this British FE-2B, did not face this dilemma, but were generally less maneuverable than the single-seat tractor. In April 1915, the French pilot Roland Garros fitted steel deflectors to the propeller blades of his Marin-Saulnier monoplane Scout. He enjoyed considerable success until engine failure forced him to land behind enemy lines. A Dutch aircraft designer, Anthony Fokker, seen here on the left, who was working for the Germans, found the true solution, an interrupter gear which synchronized the machine gun's fire with the propeller. This revolutionized air warfare on the Western Front. From August 1915, the German aircraft dominated the skies. Their biplanes and monoplanes were soon sending scores of British and French aircraft crashing to the ground. But accurate forward-firing machine guns were not the only secret to the effective fighter. Pilots soon realized that they needed to be able to outmaneuver their opponents. Thus, aerobatics became very important. One of the first to recognize this was the German ace Max Immelmann. He developed a particular maneuver which comprised a half loop with a roll off the top, which put him quickly both above and on the tail of his opponent. Here is the Immelmann turn demonstrated. So great was German dominance that in early 1916 the British laid down that every reconnaissance mission had to have armed escorts. This brought about the beginning of formation flying. Air reconnaissance, though, remained vital throughout the war. Air photography became an important element of this. Accurate maps of the trenches were drawn from air photographs. In spring 1915, the use of aircraft to direct guns onto targets also became effective with the development of air-to-ground radio. New Allied types, such as these French Nieuport babies, brought the Fokker Scourge, as it was called, to an end in time for the opening of the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. Another new Allied aircraft was the British FE-2B. This had a top speed of only 90 miles per hour, but its maneuverability was surprisingly good for a pusher. By the winter of 1916, though, the tide had turned once more, and again Allied aircraft losses mounted. Fokker, Albatros and Halberstadt quickly produced aircraft with a much better performance than the Allied types. The Germans also, at the suggestion of another of their early aces, Oswald Belcker, began to operate in the air in complete squadrons of 14 aircraft, so that they would have numerical superiority over their opponents. The climax of this period of German air ascendancy over the Western Front came in April 1917. By this time, the Germans were sending up 3 or 4 squadrons together. These became known as circuses. The most famous of these was that led by Baron Manfred von Richthofen, called the Red Baron by the British on account of the all-red Albatros and later Fokker triplane which he flew. He himself was a cavalry officer, aged 32 at the outbreak of war, old for a fighter pilot. His horseman's hands helped to make him an excellent pilot, and by early 1917 he had become one of Germany's leading aces. Eventually, he would achieve a score of 80 aircraft shot down, higher than any other pilot, before his death in action in April 1918. The British called April 1917 Bloody April, losing some 150 aircraft destroyed and 316 aircrew killed or captured. Once more, though, the fortune began to swing to the Allies, who also introduced new aircraft types. Again, this was in time for an offensive at Ypres at the end of July 1917. The French now had various types of Spad, both single and two-seaters. They also introduced the Nieuport 17, some of which the British also used alongside the Sopwith Pup, their first effective single-seater scout, which had begun to enter service at the end of 1916. This highly maneuverable little fighting scout was soon to be given other roles as well. The Pup was joined by the Sopwith triplane, the two-seater Bristol fighter, affectionately known as the Brisfit, and, shown here, the SE-5, which proved itself to be one of the best fighters of the war. It was not, however, speed which gave these aircraft the edge. Indeed, during the 4 years of war, this rose no more than 40 miles per hour from the 80 or 90 miles per hour achievable in 1914. Rather, it was maneuverability, especially in the turn and rate of climb. By now, the feats of men like these had caught the imagination of the general public on both sides. The exploits of the aces, as they had come to be called, occupied much media attention. The Germans had von Richthofen, but also Voss and Udet. The Frenchman Georges Guynemer became a national hero, as did Nungesser and Fonck. Shy 20-year-old Albert Ball was one of many British aces. Once the United States entered the war, the Americans too produced their aces, like Eddie Rickenbacker and Raoul Lufbery, who had begun his flying career as a volunteer with the French. Many of the aces did not survive the war, eventually meeting their match in combat. Lufbery's funeral was like that for a head of state. The skies over the Western Front, now daily, weather permitting, witnessed dogfights as the scouts of both sides sought battle with one another. They would each try and place themselves in the ideal position, above their opponents and between them and the sun, before attacking. Thereafter, the battle would often break up into individual contests, and it was the aircraft which could turn tightest and thus get onto its opponent's tail which was invariably the victor. For those that flew these, by modern standards, flimsy machines, their life expectancy was often much lower than that of a junior officer in the trenches. This was not just because of combat, but also because of the high frequency of aircraft accidents. Aircrew may have led a much more comfortable existence than soldiers did in the trenches, but their life was often much more hazardous. The strain of flying combat missions, sometimes up to 6 hours in the air in a day, told after a time. Nerves became ever more taut, and some eventually cracked up. In order to prevent this, the authorities instituted measures to ensure that aircrew were rested. Thus, the British made a rule that pilots should be sent home for a period after 6 months of war flying. The main object of the battle for air supremacy remained that of enabling uninterrupted air reconnaissance. Every day, armies tasked aircraft to fly out over the lines to answer specific questions on the enemy's dispositions. These missions could be hazardous in the extreme, and the relief of this crew on their safe return is evident. It was crucial that the reconnaissance aircraft crews were debriefed as soon as they landed, when what they had seen was still fresh in their minds. Their information was then passed back to headquarters, where it would be analyzed. Sometimes the decision was taken to immediately send out bombing aircraft to attack targets such as ammunition dumps, headquarters and communication centers behind the immediate battle area. This produced a new breed of aircraft, the day bomber. Initially, fighters like the FE-2B, which by 1917 had been overtaken by more efficient types, were converted to this role. Special bomb attachments were fitted with release mechanisms. The bombs themselves were comparatively small, as evidenced by these British 65 and 100-pounders. Bomb sights were very primitive, and often it was merely the pilot's judgment as to when to drop the bombs which was used. Thus, to have any chance of accuracy, the aircraft had to fly low, inviting inevitable fire from the ground. For safety reasons, the bombs were not fused until after they had been fitted to the aircraft. They were now in an armed state, making it even more hazardous for the crew should their aircraft crash. Bombers were also vulnerable to enemy fighters. For this reason, fighting scouts took on another role, that of bomber escorts. Typical of these escorts was the versatile Bristol fighter. Air gunners, or observers as they were called, usually loaded their own machine gun magazines in order to minimize the likelihood of the gun jamming, something which was often fatal in the midst of an air combat. The great advantage of the two-seater fighter over the single-seater was that the observer could at all times cover the rear. His gun was mounted on a scarf ring, which gave it maximum maneuverability. Even specialist types like this British RE-8 artillery observation aircraft were sometimes fitted with bombs in order to attack opportunity targets. Vulnerable as they were to enemy fighters and ground fire, the bombs were as often as not more to keep up the morale of the crew by giving them something to hit back with. From the beginning of the war, there had been incidents of scouts dropping bombs on ground troops and later attacking them with machine gun fire. But it was not until mid-1917 that they began to formally be used as fighter bombers during attacks across trenches. Not only could they give direct support to the attackers, but they also provided valuable information on the progress of the attack. Ground strafing, as the pilots called it, called for nerves of steel, since operating at very low level made them targets for every rifle and machine gun in the vicinity. Best known of the aircraft types which were used in this role was the British Sopwith Camel, which first appeared in France in summer 1917. Not only could it take punishment, but it also more than held its own as a fighter. Not, however, until the last few months of the war was any thought given to providing the pilot with any protection against ground fire. The result was the Sopwith Salamander, a sister of the Sopwith Dolphin shown here. This had slabs of armor plate around and under the cockpit. By September 1918, air support for ground operations had been so perfected that General Billy Mitchell, commanding the American Air Service in France, could call on the services of no less than 1,500 aircraft, French and American, of all types, for the U.S. attack at Saint-Mihiel. 2/3, including heavy bombers, were employed on interdiction deep in the German rear. This meant attacking targets which would hinder the movement of German supplies and reserves to the front. The remainder undertook close air support, as ground strafing would later be termed. The threat to the aircraft from the ground was not just rifle fire and machine guns with specially designed mountings. By the beginning of 1915, both sides had dedicated anti-aircraft guns, some static, but others mounted on trucks. It took time to grapple with the technicalities of achieving accurate fire against aircraft, but the pilots of both sides soon came to respect it. Most vulnerable were the aircraft engaged on photographic reconnaissance, which had of necessity to fly in a straight line while taking their photographs. The pattern of air warfare over the Western Front was mirrored in other theatres of war. Austrian and German grappled with Russian on the Eastern Front. Because each side deployed fewer aircraft and along a much longer front, air combat was not nearly as frequent as it was in the West. In Salonika, whose port is here being overflown by a British seaplane, and on the Italian front, air fighting took place, and did at times reach almost the intensity of that in the skies of France and Flanders. Aircraft carried out crucial reconnaissance missions against the German forces in the East African bush. In the Middle East, too, British aircraft fought German in Mesopotamia and Palestine. It was during the final September 1918 British offensive in Palestine that a stark demonstration of how air power could affect land warfare was laid on. Retreating Turkish forces were trapped and then mercilessly pounded by bombs and machine gun fire from the air. Nowhere, though, was the air war more concentrated than on the Western Front, and it remained intense right up to the very end, with the Germans faced with ever-increasing Allied superiority in numbers, continuing to give as good as they got. Air combat during 1914-18 was seen by the participants of both sides as a much cleaner war than that down below in the trenches. Indeed, some even compared it to the fights between individual knights during the Middle Ages and sought to practice the same standards of chivalry. This served to increase the glamour with which the general public embellished the air war over France and Flanders. The duel of aircraft against aircraft may have dominated the air war during 1914 to 1918, but an old method of air observation was widely employed by both sides. It also provided another target for aircraft. The observation balloon was winched up from the ground and enabled observers to both check on enemy activity and control artillery fire with much more ease than from an aircraft in flight. Contact with the ground was maintained by telephone. Balloons, however, were obvious targets. Aircraft would attack them with incendiary bullets and rockets. This made the task of the balloon observers, balloon-nautics the British called them, very dangerous. Both sides recognized this early on, and they were therefore equipped with parachutes. This was not so with aircraft crews until very late in the war. Indeed, Allied pilots never received them, the British official view being that parachutes might encourage pilots to abandon their aircraft unnecessarily. When an observer spotted an enemy fighter, he would warn the ground crew. If it began to attack, he would parachute to safety. Then the ground crew would try and winch down the balloon before it went up in flames, with anti-aircraft guns trying to drive the fighter away. Navies too employed observation balloons during the Great War. Since this was long before the advent of radar, ships had a major problem in trying to establish what was happening over the horizon. The observation balloon was partially able to overcome this, but it did have its limitations. It took a long time to inflate and winch up. It also could not be used during bad weather, for obvious reasons, and neither could it be employed when the ship was in action. Navies quickly recognized that something more was needed to increase their range of vision. Two solutions to the problem suggested themselves, both involving aircraft. The first was suggested by an exploit by a professional American pilot, Eugene Ely, who in November 1910 successfully flew his Curtiss pusher biplane off a specially constructed platform on the US cruiser Birmingham. The British carried out similar experiments using an S-27 floatplane. In 1914, however, navies preferred to use this type of aircraft, which could both land and take off in water, rather than pursue the concept of aircraft which could directly take off from and land on ships. Here is a Russian seaplane being put through its paces. The problem, though, was how to transport and operate floatplanes when at sea. The Russians tried to tow them behind ships, but this only worked in fair weather. The Germans, on the other hand, were content to launch them from slipways, since their high seas fleet seldom ventured from harbour and then only into the North Sea. They did, however, use floatplanes for purposes other than reconnaissance, as this unusual piece of footage shows. It was left to the Royal Navy to solve the problem. The British converted an old light cruiser, the Hermes, so that it could operate 2 float planes. Subsequently, the Cunard liner Campania, seen here, was similarly converted and was able to carry no less than 11 aircraft. It was, however, a lengthy business to prepare them for flight. Equipped with wheels fitted to the floats, these aircraft were able to make deck takeoffs. On return, the float plane would land beside the ship and then be winched aboard, another laborious process. This ability to be able to fold the seaplane's wings was especially important, given the limited space within the ship's hangar. A further 3 ships, all cross-channel steamers, were converted at the beginning of the war to operate as seaplane carriers. One of these was the Engadine, shown here. She could carry 3 and later 4 float planes. Initially, her ability to handle seaplanes was poor, and in early 1915 she had to undergo extensive modifications to make her more effective. These were successful, and it was one of her aircraft which first sighted the German high seas fleet at sea just before the major naval clash at Jutland on the last day of May 1916. Unfortunately, the pilot was unable to get his report of the sighting through to the Grand Fleet. Seaplane carriers did not, however, have the deck space for takeoffs to be made from them, and the seaplane had to be first winched into the water. For long-range maritime reconnaissance, however, the airship was ideal, and at the start of the war this was the main role of the German Zeppelin. Capital ships also began to be equipped with a single seaplane in order to increase the fleet's reconnaissance capability. The British also began to develop torpedo-carrying aircraft for use against ships. Air power began to be deployed against the submarine at an early stage in the war. The hard-working, short seaplane was initially the main British aerial anti-submarine weapon. This could be armed with bombs, which were used not just to attack the U-boats themselves, but also their bases. In this respect, the first such operation was carried out by the Royal Naval Air Service in autumn 1914, when its aircraft attacked a suspected U-boat base at Antwerp with bombs. With the advent of the first unrestricted U-boat campaign against merchant shipping in early 1915, the Admiralty realized that more would have to be done. The seaplane lacked the endurance to be effective in the anti-submarine role, and other means were clearly needed. One answer to the problem was the flying boat, as opposed to seaplane. The pioneer of this aircraft type was the American designer Glenn Curtiss. In 1916, Wing Commander Port, seen here with the watch chain, who commanded the Royal Naval Air Service base at Felixstowe on England's east coast, took Curtiss's H-12 large America flying boat and adapted it for anti-submarine warfare. He strengthened its hull, armed it with 7 machine guns and 2 230-pound bombs, and gave it an endurance of 6 hours flying time. Its first success came in May 1917, when it sank a U-boat with a bomb. The Port and the later F-2 and F-5 flying boats also sank 2 Zeppelins in German home waters. This provoked the Germans to strengthen their own naval air arm, and there were a number of clashes between opposing maritime aircraft. The other solution was the non-rigid airship. The British Admiralty produced the SS, or Submarine Searching Airship, here seen being wheeled out and launched. Powered by a 75 horsepower Rolls-Royce Hawk engine, the SS could achieve a speed of 46 knots. The pipe extending over the propeller was used to channel air from the latter into the envelope in order to maintain the pressure inside it. When in flight, these SS airships proved to be surprisingly maneuverable. A second type of blimp used by the British was the larger Coastal Star class. Its gondola was based on a BE-2C aircraft fuselage. By the end of the war, these airships could remain aloft for up to 48 hours and were equipped with radio and bombs. A method was also developed for winching people up into the airship from ships at sea, a technique now extensively used by helicopters, especially in the air-sea rescue role. While these airships were armed with machine guns and bombs, they were in practice too unstable a platform to be accurate in attacking a pinpoint target like a U-boat. Their normal technique was, therefore, to operate closely with surface warships and direct them onto the target. Work on developing a true aircraft carrier, which would allow both deck takeoffs and landings, was pursued by the British. Initially, the wheeled floatplane continued to be used in order to develop flight decks which would give the aircraft a better chance of attaining flying speed before it ran out of deck. But landings were not possible until an aircraft could be found with a sufficiently short minimum takeoff and landing distance. The answer came at the end of 1916, with the introduction into service of the Sopwith Pup. Such was the versatility of this little land-based fighter that battleships and cruisers of the Royal Navy were able to launch it from makeshift runways made up of wooden planks placed across the twin guns of each turret. The runways themselves could be very quickly constructed and dismantled. By the end of the war, no less than 100 Sopwith pups were being used in this highly original way. In particular, they were able to deter Zeppelins, and the first success was achieved in August 1917, when a pup flying from the cruiser HMS Yarmouth, which was escorting mine layers off the Dutch coast, intercepted Zeppelin L-23 and quickly reduced it to a mass of flames. There was, however, no way in which they could land on these makeshift runways. It was, of course, relatively easy to recover float planes by winching them on board, and drills for doing so became ever more slick. For land-based aircraft, it was more difficult. Flotation bags were fitted in order to keep them afloat while winching took place. Often, though, they were not effective, and by the time the aircraft was recovered, it was unfit to make further flights. In August 1917, however, there was a breakthrough. A Sopwith pup was successfully landed on HMS Furious, a cruiser which had been converted to an aircraft carrier by building a flight deck forward of her bridge. It took much skill because the ship's bridge and funnels were amidships, which still severely restricted the landing space. Sadly, 5 days later, the pilot, Flight Commander Dunning, was killed attempting the same maneuver. In an attempt to make landings easier, aircraft had skids fitted to them. These, however, did not reduce the risk by much. Furious later had a flight deck the length of the ship. This made her the first true carrier as we know it today. By late 1918, maritime air power had shown its potential influence on the war at sea. The ideas were there, but technology, aeronautical and nautical, needed to advance further. The Great War also showed air power being used in another role, one that was independent of land and sea forces. In the very first weeks of the war, aircraft attacked targets behind the battle lines with primitive bombs. Then, on the 30th of August 1914, a German Rumpler Taube two-seater reconnaissance aircraft dropped 5 small bombs on Paris, killing a woman and injuring 2 other people. This could have been an illegal act, since the 1899 Hague Declaration banned the launching of any form of projectile from an aerial vehicle. But this was before the powered aircraft had arrived, and the major nations later refused to ratify the ban. In January 1915, the Kaiser sanctioned raids by Zeppelins against British naval and military installations. That same month, the first, by 2 Zeppelins, took place, and killed 4 and injured 16 civilians on England's east coast. This was not intentional. The Zeppelins did not appear again until April, by which time they were operating from Belgium. Others, like this one over Warsaw, attacked targets in Poland in support of the German spring and summer 1915 offensives against the Russians. The Zeppelins attacked London for the first time on the last night of May 1915, and 7 civilians were killed. By this time, crude defences had been organised, a few guns and searchlights, and the dimming of streetlights, but they were of little use. Nevertheless, a week later, the first victory of an aircraft over a Zeppelin occurred when a Royal Naval Air Service aircraft intercepted LZ-37 over Belgium, climbed above and dropped bombs on it. Further Zeppelin attacks were made during 1916, but by now the British defences had improved. These increased the toll of downed airships and the attacks petered out. In the meantime, the Italians had been developing long-range bombing aircraft. Capronis like these began to wing their way over the Alps to attack targets in Austria, especially the port of Pola, at the head of the Adriatic. The Russians, on the other hand, already had a large bomber in 1914, the 4-engined Ilya Muromets, designed by Igor Sikorsky, later the helicopter pioneer. The Germans too had been developing long-range bombers, and in May 1917 they began to attack England by day from bases in Belgium. Shown here is the Starken bomber, which was capable of carrying 2 tons of bombs, and was the largest aircraft to go into series production during the war. It was, however, the smaller Gotha bombers which carried out the early raids. Capable of a speed of 87 miles per hour, with a 1,000-pound bomb load, they attacked London twice during June 1917, causing the deaths of 200 civilians, with many more injured. Near panic set in. There was almost a riot in one of London's poorest areas, the East End, and munition workers failed to turn up at their factories. 2 crack fighter squadrons were hastily brought back from France in order to help deal with this new threat. Furthermore, a committee was set up under bearded South African General Jan Smuts to make recommendations on how to overcome this menace. Among these were rockets and other techniques for warning people of impending raids. More home defense fighter squadrons were created, and these were more closely integrated with the anti-aircraft guns and early warning systems. All this was hastily put into effect, and did force the Germans, as they had done with their Zeppelins, to turn to attacks by night. By the following spring, the defences were proving effective. The last raid on London, in May 1918, resulted in 6 bombers being shot down. Even so, an American airman noted during this raid, "It doesn't matter whether they hit anything, as long as they put the wind up the civilian population. These people wanted peace, and they wanted it badly." The desire to retaliate for the raids on London during summer 1917 was strong, and that autumn British bombers were sent to eastern France to begin attacks on targets in Germany. These included the giant Handley Page bomber, which had been developed for the Royal Naval Air Service for attacks on Zeppelin bases. Industrial targets in southwest Germany were selected, but the weather prevented more than a few raids during the winter, although they increased during 1918 as the force was expanded. By the end of the Great War, strategic bombers were posing a question. Would it be possible in the future for air forces to win wars on their own by attacking a nation's will to fight? The world would have to wait for 25 years before any form of clear answer could be given to this.